She was a mother. That's the first thing you need to understand about Shanae Decree. Before anything else, before the charges, before the courtroom, before the details that will make you stop and stare at the wall for a minute, she was somebody's mother. She had children who called her name, a sister who trusted her, a family that gathered around her inside a small apartment in Morrisville, Pennsylvania. But before we continue, kindly tell us where you're watching from.
They were all going through something religiously, and they decided to drag the kids into it.
Held without bail, the mother and her 19-year-old daughter accused of murdering their family members are staying behind bars today. They've allegedly confessed to their crime, saying everyone, even the 3 children, wanted to die.
And investigators say that on a cold February afternoon in 2019, she helped take 5 of their lives, including her own 1 3-year-old son. Take a moment with that. Because this case doesn't fit neatly into any box. It doesn't follow the pattern of the stories we tell ourselves about violence, the stranger, the monster, the person nobody saw coming. Shanae wasn't a stranger to the people who died in that apartment. She was their person, their family, their mother, their sister, their aunt. And that is precisely what makes this one of the most haunting cases to ever come out of Bucks County, Pennsylvania. 5 people died inside Unit S5 at the Robert Morris Apartments on or around the 25th of February 2019. Their names were Nay Ira Smith, Damon Decree Jr., Jamila Campbell, Erica Allen, and Imani Allen. A 2-5-year-old young woman. A 1-3-year-old boy. A 4-2-year-old mother. And 2 9-year-old twin girls who never saw any of it coming. All of them family. All of them gone. This is their story. Morrisville is a small borough in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. The kind of place that doesn't usually make national headlines. Sitting just across the Delaware River from Trenton, New Jersey, it's a working-class community with quiet streets and a tight-knit feel. The Robert Morris Apartments on West Bridge Street were modest by any measure. Small units, practical layouts, the kind of housing that gets filled by families doing what they need to do to get by. Shauna Selena Decree was 45 years old in February of 2019. She had lived in that apartment complex with her children for some time, and by the time investigators arrived on that February afternoon, the unit she called home had become something far removed from what most people would recognize as a stable household. 8 people were living inside one small apartment. 8. That's the first thing that tells you something had gone wrong long before February 25th. Not because large families are unusual, not because people don't share space out of necessity, but because 8 people in one tiny unit, in conditions investigators described as cramped and overcrowded, creates a kind of pressure that compounds everything else happening inside those walls. And inside those walls, a great deal was happening. Shauna had several children. Her eldest daughter, Nayara Smith, was 25 and lived with her. Her son, Damon Decree Jr., was 13. Still a child, still in the years where a mother's world is supposed to be a safe place. And then there was Dominique Kieran. Decree was 19 years old, Shauna's daughter, and she too lived in that apartment. She and her mother were close in a way that went beyond the ordinary bond between a parent and child. Dominique moved in Shauna's orbit completely. What her mother believed, she believed. Where her mother led, she followed. That closeness, that alignment, would sit at the very center of what investigators will later piece together. Then there was Shauna's sister. Jamila Campbell was 42 years old and lived in Trenton, New Jersey, just a short distance away. At some point, before February 2019, Jamila had come to stay at the West Bridge Street apartment. She brought her children with her, her teenage son, Joshua Campbell, and her twin daughters, Erica Allen and Imani Allen, 9 years old, both of them, 9 years old. Whatever brought Jamila to that apartment, whether it was family loyalty, financial need, or something else entirely. She had placed herself and her children inside a household that was quietly unraveling. And by the time the danger became visible, it was already far too late to leave. This was a family bound together by blood and history, by shared meals and shared space, and the kind of intimacy that only comes from years of being in each other's lives. But something had gotten into that family. Something had taken root in the months before February 2019, and it was pulling them, all of them, in a direction that no one on the outside fully understood until the bodies were found. There was already a Department of Human Services case connected to that household before the 25th of February 2019. The full details of that case were not released publicly. Investigators were careful to protect the integrity of the proceedings. But the existence of that case is significant. It means that somewhere in the system, a flag had been raised. Someone had asked questions about the children inside that apartment. Someone had looked at that household and determined that it warranted attention. That attention, whatever form it took, was not enough. In the months leading up to the killings, people connected to the Decree family began to notice that something was changing. The family was withdrawing. Phone calls stopped being returned. Visits became unwelcome. The ordinary connections that hold people to the world around them, school, neighbors, extended family, community, were quietly being severed. One by one, the threads that tied the Decree's household to normal life were being cut. And then, there was what was happening online. What emerged from the investigation, and from accounts given by people who knew the family, painted a picture that was as disturbing as it was difficult to fully comprehend. The family had become involved with something online, an online group, something that, in the words of those who tried to describe it, functioned like a cult. It had reached into their world through screens and devices and digital spaces, and it had begun to rewire the way they thought, the way they interpreted reality, the way they understood their own lives and the lives of the people around them. Family members described it as the family being dissected into some type of cult that they materialized online. There were beliefs about demons, about spiritual forces, about the outside world being a place of corruption and danger from which the people inside that apartment needed to be protected, or perhaps from which they needed to escape entirely. This is how isolation becomes something more dangerous than loneliness, because once a family stops engaging with the outside world, the inside world expands to fill every available space. And when the ideas filling that inside world come from somewhere dark, from a belief system built around death and demons, and the desire to leave this life behind, the consequences can become catastrophic. The idea of dying together began to take shape inside that apartment. Investigators would later describe what they believed was a possible murder-suicide pact, a shared belief among the adults in the household that they were ready to go, that the world had nothing left to offer them. That death was not an ending, but something they were moving toward together as a family. Shauna herself would later tell investigators that the people in that apartment had been talking about it, that they wanted to die, that there had been discussions, agreements, a shared understanding of what was coming. But you have to stop and ask yourself something. Erica Allen was 9 years old. Imani Allen was 9 years old. Damon Decree Jr. was 13 years old. Those are children, not adults processing grief or navigating a spiritual crisis. Children. And no child, not one, has the capacity to consent to their own death at the hands of a parent or an aunt or anyone else in that apartment. Whatever conversations took place, whatever agreements the adults believed they had reached, those 3 children were not participants in any meaningful sense. That is the wound at the heart of this case, and it does not heal. The days immediately before February 25th are not fully mapped in the public record. But what investigators would piece together from the physical evidence, from forensic findings, and from the statements given by the 2 women found at the scene was that, in those final days, the household had crossed a line from which there was no return. The beliefs had hardened. The plan, well, whatever it was, had moved from idea to action, and 5 people paid for it with their lives. On the afternoon of the 25th of February 2019, a welfare check was called in for the apartment at 200 West Bridge Street. Bucks County detectives and officers from the Morrisville Police Department responded. It was around 4 when they arrived at Unit S5. They knocked, they entered, and the investigation that followed would keep law enforcement working through the night. What officers found inside Unit S5 was something that none of them would easily forget. 5 people dead in a small, overcrowded apartment that smelled of closed living and something far worse. The space that 8 people had been sharing, cramped and cluttered and pressed full with the evidence of daily life, had become something else entirely. A crime scene, a burial ground, a place where a family had ended. The victims were found inside the apartment, all of them. There was no sign of forced entry, no indication that anyone had broken in from the outside. Whatever had happened in that unit, it had happened from within. And the 2 women who had been part of that household, Shanna Decree and her daughter Dominique, were still there when police arrived, still in the apartment among the dead. That detail is important because it tells you something about the state of mind of the 2 women who were taken into custody that afternoon. They hadn't fled. They hadn't tried to disappear. Whether that was because they believed they had done nothing wrong, or because they were in some altered state that made flight impossible, or because whatever plan had existed inside that apartment had not fully concluded. Investigators would spend considerable time working through those questions. Dominique had visible injuries when officers arrived, marks on her neck. The kind of injuries consistent with someone who had also been subjected to some form of strangulation. That detail complicated the initial scene in ways that would need to carefully untangle. Was she a victim? A perpetrator? Both? The answer, as the investigation developed, would become clearer. But in those first moments, nothing about what police were looking at was simple. Both women were described as disoriented at the scene. Not combative, not fleeing, disoriented. Present in body, but somewhere else entirely in mind, they were taken into custody. And then, the work of understanding what had happened to 5 members of the Decree and Campbell families began. The victims were identified in the hours that followed. Naira Smith, 25 years old, Shauna's eldest daughter. Damon Decree Jr., 13 years old, Shauna's son. Jamila Campbell, 42 years old, Shauna's sister. And Erica Allen and Imani Allen, Jamila's twin daughters, both 9 years old. 5 people, 3 generations of the same family. When the coroner's findings were released, they told a story that was as precise as it was devastating. 4 of the 5 victims, Naira, Damon, Erica, and Imani, died by homicidal asphyxia. They were suffocated. The life was physically pressed or blocked out of them one by one in that small apartment. Jamila Campbell, the sister's mother and the girl's mother, died differently. She died by homicidal ligature strangulation. Something was used around her neck, tightened until she was gone. Sit with the order of that for a moment. Jamila was the adult, 42 years old, a mother herself, and the method used to kill her was different from the method used on the others. Whether that speaks to a struggle, to resistance, to the specific circumstances of her death, the record does not say explicitly, but it is a detail that investigators noted carefully. And then there were the children. Erica and Imani Allen were 9 years old. They were in that apartment because their mother had brought them there, because family was supposed to mean safety, because a child's understanding of the world does not include the possibility that the adults around them, the ones they call auntie, the ones who share meals with them, the ones who are supposed to be their people, could do what was done in that apartment. They were suffocated. In a small apartment in Morrisville, Pennsylvania, on or around the 25th of February, 2019, 2-9-year-old girls were suffocated to death, along with their mother, along with their teenage cousin, along with their 2 5-year-old cousin, Naira. 5 people, all family, all gone. The timeline of exactly when each person died and in what sequence was part of what investigators worked to reconstruct in the hours and days that followed the discovery. The apartment was small enough that whatever happened, it happened in close quarters. There was no distance between the victims and the people who killed them. No buffer, no separation, just the terrible intimacy of a family destroying itself from within. What the physical evidence showed, what the forensic examination of the scene revealed, pointed clearly and directly at the 2 women who had been found inside that apartment, Shanae Decree and Dominique Decree. Mother and daughter, the people who were supposed to be the anchors of that family, charged each of them with 5 counts of criminal homicide and 1 count of criminal conspiracy. The DA, Matt Weintraub, stood before cameras the following afternoon and described it plainly. 5 murders, 2 suspects, both in custody, both facing charges that carried the possibility of life in prison. He also said something else, something quieter, and in some ways more telling than anything else he offered that day. He said he wished he didn't have to report it, that he wished they didn't have to deal with it. When a prosecutor says that, a man whose career is built around confronting the worst of what human beings do to one another, you understand the weight of what was found in that apartment. The investigation moved fast. That much is clear from the public record. Within half a day of arriving at the scene, Bucks County detectives and Morrisville police had processed enough of what they found to place both Shayna and Dominique Decree under arrest and begin the process of filing charges. Shauna was arraigned at 3:30 inches the morning, hours after the bodies were discovered, and held without bail. Dominique's arraignment followed shortly after, delayed slightly because she was still receiving medical attention for the injuries found on her neck. Both were held. Neither was going anywhere. But the speed of the arrests didn't mean the investigation was simple. Far from it. What detectives were working through was not just a question of who. That part had been answered almost immediately by the presence of the 2 women at the scene. The harder question, the one that D.A. Weintraub acknowledged openly at his press conference, was why. And on that question, even in the harsh light of the day following the discovery, investigators did not have a clean answer. What they did have were statements. The details of exactly what Shauna and Dominique told investigators in those early interviews were protected. The DA was careful not to disclose the specifics publicly, citing the defendant's right to a fair trial. But enough emerged through the affidavits and charging documents to begin sketching the shape of the motive. Shauna reportedly told investigators that the victims had wanted to die, that everyone in the apartment had been talking about it, that there had been discussions, ongoing collective discussions, about leaving this world behind. She framed what happened not as murder, but as something agreed upon, something the family had moved toward together. Investigators were not buying it. Not entirely, not without interrogating every detail of that claim against the physical evidence, against the forensic findings, against everything they knew about the people who had died in that apartment. Because here is what the evidence said. The victims did not die in ways consistent with a peaceful, willing departure. Asphyxiation and ligature strangulation are not gentle. They are not passive. They involve force. They involve proximity. They involve one person actively taking the life of another. And 3 of those victims were children. 2 of them 9 years old, which made the "they wanted to die" claim not just legally insufficient, but morally obscene. Detectives also began pulling on the thread of the online cult connection, the belief system that had apparently taken hold inside that apartment. The idea that this family had been drawn into something digital and dark, something that had reshaped their understanding of life, death, and what they owed to one another. Investigators described the family as having been absorbed into a type of online cult, one that had fed them ideas about demons, about spiritual warfare, about the desire to leave this world as a unit. That thread was difficult to pull cleanly. Online belief systems of this kind are diffused by nature. They don't have a single leader issuing orders. They operate through suggestion and reinforcement, through communities that validate increasingly extreme ideas, through the slow erosion of a person's ability to evaluate reality independently. Proving the exact nature and extent of that influence in a court of law was going to be complex, but it mattered for understanding. Not as an excuse, never as an excuse, but as context for how a mother, a woman with children she had raised, a sister she had grown up with, nieces she had known since birth, could arrive at the place she apparently arrived at in that apartment. There was also the matter of the DHS case, the active child welfare investigation that had already flagged concerns about the household before February 25th. Investigators looked at what that case had documented, at what the system had known and when, and whether any intervention had been possible that might have changed the outcome. Those questions did not produce comfortable answers. And then there was Joshua. Joshua Campbell was Jamila's teenage son. He had been living in the apartment along with everyone else. When police arrived and began accounting for the residents of Unit S5, Joshua was not there. He was not among the dead. He was not at the scene. For a period of time that evening, his whereabouts were unknown. Investigators were looking for him urgently, given what they had found inside that apartment. The possibility that he was another victim somewhere outside the unit could not be immediately ruled out. And then, late that night, he was found. Alive, safe. The reason Joshua survived was not complicated. He simply had not been in the apartment when the killings occurred. Where he was exactly, and why he was absent at that particular time, those details were not fully disclosed publicly. But the fact of his survival was described by D.A. Weintraub as the one piece of good news he had to offer in an otherwise devastating press conference. One teenager, alive. 4 family members, and a 25-year-old young woman, gone. The investigation continued in the weeks that followed. The coroner worked through the forensic details of each death. Detectives built the evidentiary case that would be presented in court. The affidavits and criminal complaints were released publicly through the Bucks County DA's Crime Watch page, laying out the factual basis for the charges against both women. The case that emerged from that process was not built on ambiguity. The physical evidence, the forensic findings, the statements made by the defendants, and the circumstances in which they were found all pointed in the same direction, toward Shanna, toward Dominique, toward the 2 women who had been left standing in an apartment full of their own families' bodies. Both women were evaluated for mental illness in the period between their arrest and their eventual court proceedings. The evaluations confirmed what the circumstances had already suggested, that severe mental illness was present, that whatever had happened inside that apartment had not occurred in a mind operating within the bounds of ordinary reality. The beliefs, the isolation, the apparent conviction that what they were doing was somehow sanctioned or agreed upon, all of it pointed to a profound departure from rational thought. But Pennsylvania law draws a careful and deliberate line between mental illness and legal insanity. Being mentally ill does not automatically mean being legally insane. It does not automatically mean being incapable of understanding that what you are doing is wrong. And in the case of Shanna and Dominique Decree, the legal system would ultimately determine that the line between those 2 things had not been crossed in a way that absolved them of responsibility. The case moved toward resolution, toward a courtroom, toward a reckoning that the 5 people who died in Unit S5 deserved, even if no verdict could ever fully account for what was lost. In September of 2020, roughly 18 months after the bodies were found in that small Morrisville apartment, Shanna Decree and Dominique Decree entered their pleas, guilty but mentally ill. 5 counts of criminal homicide, 1 count of criminal conspiracy. Each of them, both of them. The guilty but mentally ill designation was not a backdoor out of accountability. It was not a reduced charge or a softened consequence. It was a legal acknowledgement that severe mental illness had been present, while simultaneously affirming that it did not rise to the level of legal insanity. They knew enough. They understood enough. And so they were held responsible. The sentencing that followed left no room for interpretation. 5 consecutive life sentences each. No possibility of parole. Sinead Decree and Dominique Decree will die in prison. There is no other outcome available to them now. No appeal that changes that mathematics. No future in which they walk out of a correctional facility and back into the world. For now, Ira. For Damon. For Jamila. For Erica. For Imani. 5 lives. 5 sentences. 1 for each person who never came home. Joshua Campbell lost his mother and his sisters on the same day. He was a teenager. He went from being part of a family to being the only one left. Not because of anything he did, but simply because he happened to not be there. That is a weight that no person should have to carry. And he will carry it for the rest of his life. There are people in Morrisville and in Trenton and in the wider Bucks County community who still think about Erica and Imani Allen. 2-9. Year. Old girls. Twin sisters. The kind of children who should exist in the world as adults now. So laughing somewhere, building something, becoming someone. Instead, their names are attached to a case number, to a press conference, to a DA standing at a podium saying he wished he didn't have to be there. This case raises questions that the justice system alone cannot answer. Questions about what happens when mental illness goes untreated inside a closed and isolated household. Questions about what online spaces can do to a vulnerable mind, how they can reach in and reconstruct a person's entire understanding of reality until death starts to look like a solution. Questions about the systems that are supposed to catch families in freefall before they hit the ground. And what happens when those systems move too slowly or not at all. The DHS case was already open. The flag had already been raised, and 5 people still died. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with. It was not comfortable for the investigators who worked that scene. It was not comfortable for DA Weintraub when he stood before those cameras. And it should not be comfortable for any of us, because the uncomfortable truth is that Erica and Imani Allen were 9 years old, and they were inside a system that was supposed to see them. Shoshana Decree is in prison. Dominique Decree is in prison. They will remain there. The legal chapter of this story is closed, but Neera Smith was 25 years old and had her whole life ahead of her. Damon Decree Jr. was 13 and still becoming who he was going to be. Jamila Campbell was 42 years old and was somebody's mother, somebody's sister, somebody's person. And Erica and Imani Allen were 9 years old, and they were somebody's everything. They deserved more than what happened to them in that apartment. They deserved more than a welfare check that came too late. They deserved more than 5 consecutive life sentences as a substitute for their futures. Remember their names: Neera, Damon, Jamila, Erica, Imani. Say them out loud if you have to, because that's the least we can do. Make sure that the names of the people who were lost in that apartment on West Bridge Street outlast the details of the case, outlast the press conferences and the charging documents and the sentencing hearings. They were here, they were loved, and they were taken far too soon.